first one we'll talk about that tends to be pretty much universal is emotion. So all people all across the globe tend to experience and express emotion in similar ways. This is Paul Ekman right here. I may have mentioned him briefly in our chapter on emotion, but he suggests that some of the basic emotional states that you're going to see in people across the globe are things like fear, anger, happiness, sadness, disgust, and surprise. And so Ekman has some pretty fascinating research. One thing that he found is that based on photographs of emotional expressions, so just pictures like you see right here, everyone across the world, all human beings, are able to recognize what these expressions mean. So how the people, this is Ekman, as I mentioned, and so how he would be feeling when making all of these different faces. And so one of his more interesting studies involved him traveling over to Papua New Guinea, which is this really isolated culture just north of Australia. And so he talked to some of the tribesmen over there. And this was a good sample for him to use to test out his ideas because, like I said, it's extremely isolated. They don't have much contact at all with Western culture over there, or at least they didn't when he did this research. So they don't have movies, TV, newspapers, magazine. So they wouldn't have really had much contact with people from our culture. And so he brought pictures of American college students who were making facial expressions over there, and they were able, the tribesmen were able to identify the faces. And then he had the tribesmen make some faces, and then took pictures of them and brought them over to the American students to identify. And so he would tell them things like, make the face that you would make if you were walking around outside and you met some friends, and they'd go kind of like this. Or make the face that you would make if you found out that your child had died, and they'd make a sad face. And so he would take photographs of them as they imagined these different scenarios, and then American college students could successfully match up the scenario that was described with the facial expression. So yeah, the bottom line from all this is just that emotions are very deeply rooted as part of human nature, or just in our genes. So, any questions about this? Right. So, oh, I hate it when I forget to put bullet points up. I'll let y'all get that. Alright, so next we're going to look at some research that examines the beliefs that people hold about men and women across cultures. So this is going to go back to some of the things that we talked about in the sex and gender chapter. So again, no matter where you go across the globe, you see these differences in the way that people think about men and women. So we'll begin by talking about how men are usually perceived. So across cultures, men are thought to be more active, louder, more adventurous, more obnoxious. It only goes downhill for us from here, guys. More aggressive, which that was one of the big sex differences that we talked about. That one's pretty clearly rooted in reality. Men are believed to be more opinionated, more arrogant, coarse, and conceited. And so again, they find this across cultures. They have these surveys that people do that they say, in general, do you perceive this to be more characteristic of men or more characteristic of women? And it's pretty much universal that people say, yeah, men are more these things than women. All right. So, oh, did you have a question?
Hold on a minute.
Oh, okay. All right. Okay. And so now let's talk about women and how women are perceived. I like to use The Simpsons for this demonstration here. So women tend to be thought of as being more affectionate than men, more modest, possibly more nervous, more appreciative, more patient, more changeable, in other words, willing to adopt new ideas. This is going to be kind of like that big five trait of openness to new ideas and new experiences. So it doesn't necessarily mean fickle. More charming and more fearful. So this is very descriptive. This is what people across cultures think or believe about men and women. I want to ask you all, why do you think that we find these differences? Does this say anything meaningful about the nature of men and women?
In evolution, it was probably better for a man to be more aggressive and for a woman to, take care of the family. Should have to be affectionate, or, should have to have all these nice qualities.
Okay, so that's a suggestion that there might be some biological basis, so some evolved differences between men and women that have led to real differences in these types of characteristics. Right? Does anybody have any other suggestions? Anybody think that these might just be kind of stereotypes that persist throughout these cultures?
Maybe from when men had to go out and be the breadwinners when they had to kill the animals and hunt and do all those violent things.
Okay, so the good old hunter-gatherer perspective, yeah, men were more likely to go out and hunt animals. I mean, that's debated a little bit among evolutionary psychologists, but it's believed for the most part that men had to go out and hunt, whereas women did more of the gathering. And you see some evidence of this in modern hunter-gatherer societies, like that Hadza tribe in Tanzania that I've talked about. The men go out and hunt, the women gather roots and berries.
But it could be kind of like a social thing.
Okay.
The way people are socialized. Because, you can see some of these traits in men, and you can see some of the quote-unquote masculine traits in women. So,
okay. Yeah, so it could have something to do with the way that people are socialized. What they learn is acceptable behaviors for men and acceptable behaviors for women. So there are those differences in gender roles that we've talked about. And honestly, it's probably a little bit of both. I mean, to some extent these things are rooted in biology, but of course people aren't only the product of their genes, we're the product of our experiences as well. So while we may have tendencies to behave in a particular way, our experiences and the way that we're socialized really shape that. Okay, so let's see. Let's talk a little bit more about cross-cultural similarities in the way that people think about others. So some personality psychologists have looked for common elements in personality evaluation. And what they found is that there are two basic dimensions that tend to be used by everyone when describing and evaluating personality. So, in other words, if you go to some other culture and ask people to describe one of their friends or describe someone that they know, they tend to use these two traits, these two dimensions, more than anything else. Anybody want to take a guess as to what they are? What was that?
Nice. If they're a nice person.
Okay, so how friendly they are? Yeah, that's actually one of them. Anything else? Guess as to what the other one might be?
How helpful?
Attractive?
These are good guesses, helpfulness and attractiveness. Attractiveness in particular is one that people tend to notice, and helpfulness is going to be important. It's actually dominance and submissiveness. So the two big dimensions are dominance and submissiveness, and friendliness and hostility. So if someone is really bossy and pushy and they take charge, that tends to get incorporated in descriptions. Or if they're a real pushover and kind of a submissive, weak personality, that gets included along with how friendly they are. And so, do these two dimensions sound familiar? We might have seen these at an earlier point in the semester in talking about our taxonomies. Anybody remember this? Do you remember the name of the taxonomy that used these dimensions? Yeah, right on. Yeah, it was the Wiggins circumflex. So Wiggins had that whole theory that the two big dimensions that you should measure in order to understand personality are dominance and submissiveness, or friendliness and hostility. So if you measure both of those and get that combination, then you can understand a lot about people's social relationships. So maybe Wiggins was onto something. Not that many people use Wiggins circumflex anymore because of the big five, but that is interesting that we find this independently of his taxonomy. So, of course, good old big five, we can't have a day without that. Like I said when we first talked about this personality inventory, the five-factor model is fairly universal, so we see evidence of this across cultures. But 4 of the 5 traits tend to come out more clearly than the 5th one. So usually researchers will use that technique that we talked about before, that factor analysis, to try to find common elements in people's behaviors. And so these 4 of the big 5 come out in the factor analysis really reliably. Conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. So but what was the 5th one? At least in American participants as we've talked about it?
Openness.
Yeah, openness. So that's the 5th factor that is usually agreed upon, but like I said, it's a little bit less stable across cultures. So there is some more recent research that suggests that one additional dimension that might need to be added to the big 5 based on some of this cross-cultural research is honesty and humility. So there are a lot of individual differences in how honest and humble people are. So any questions about that? All right, well, we're actually done for today, so don't forget, our next test is on Friday. Use that study guide, and I'll see you then.